You ever just want to eat a little fancy boy sandwich? Yeah, me too. All right, the first step in our journey to Fancy Boy Sandwichdom today is going to be to make some peach preserves. To do that, I got 3 peaches here, and I'm going to blanch them so that I can peel them. And to make that easier, I'm going to score the bottom of them with a little X. When you're making these little incisions in the bottoms of the peaches, try to go as shallow as you possibly can. You normally don't want to cut into the flesh at all, but we're going to cook these anyways later, so it doesn't matter if you go into the flesh a little bit. So once my water's up to a boil, I'm going to drop those peaches in for no more than a minute, I'd say. Probably like 45 seconds is ideal. You don't really want to cook the peaches at all at this point. Not that it's really going to affect it in this context because, like I said, we're cooking the peaches anyways. But the more you cook the flesh, the more slippery they're going to be. So they're going to be harder to handle. So just about 45 seconds later, I'm going to take those out and set them on my board there. And I want those to cool down a little bit just so they're a little easier to handle. And in the meanwhile, I will prep the other ingredient for my preserves, which is going to be 1 green apple. I'm using a green apple for this for a couple of different reasons. One, green apples have a lot of malic acid in them, which will help kind of season the preserves and brighten it up a little bit in the end, but also because green apples have a lot of pectin in them, which peaches are kind of lacking in. The pectin is going to help the preserves set up into a more jammy texture and not be super runny. So all I'm going to do with this is peel it and then cut it into quarters and then snip out the core, and then I'm going to cut those into some random chunks and throw it all into my food processor. Okay, so once I get the green apple in, the peaches should be cool enough to handle at this point, so I'm going to start peeling them. And you can see after the scoring and blanching here, just how easily most of the skin will come off. This one still had a couple stubborn spots on it, but that's okay. You can kind of scrape at it with a knife a little bit if you need a handle on it, but most of it should come off pretty easily with minimal effort. There, you can see all the skin on this one came off really, really easily. Okay, now I'm doing the third peach here, and that spot doesn't look good. Is this peach okay? Ooh. Okay, so like I said, I'm gonna do 2 peaches today, but that's okay. 2 peaches for this is gonna be just fine. It'll still work out fine, and that's something I kind of like to stress with cooking, is that it's really not as much of an exact science as some people might think it is. You can make decisions like that on the fly, and everything's gonna be fine. Okay, so now I gotta get the pits out of these, and if there's an elegant way to do this, I don't know what it is. Normally what I like to do is right where that incision is at the bottom from earlier, I go into the crosshairs there with my thumbs and kind of just rip it apart off of the pit. And then once I have enough access to the pit, I just pull it out. And especially for this application, it's all gonna get blended up anyways. It really doesn't matter what this looks like at this point. Okay, so that all goes in the food processor, and I'm gonna process this until it's all pretty smooth. You don't have to do that. If you want a little more texture in yours, you can just like dice up the peaches and keep them that way. I'm going for something a little bit smoother today, so this is what I'm gonna do. Whatever kind of texture you want in your final preserves though, I would suggest at least blending up the apple, because apples are a lot firmer than peaches, obviously. So if you have big chunks of apples in the final product, they're gonna stand out texturally. So I would suggest at least blending that up, but the peaches, do whatever you want with them. Oh, now might be a good time to mention that I'm not preparing these preserves for canning for long-term storage today. I mentioned that what I'm doing here is not an exact science today. Canning kind of is an exact science. You have to monitor like the pH of the jams, and you have to go through a bunch of sterilization steps to make sure everything's good and can be stable at room temperature for months on end. I'm just making a small batch of something that's gonna last in the fridge for a few days. So I'm not going through any of those steps. That's a whole nother topic. Okay, so once that's smooth, I'm gonna pour it out into kind of a medium-sized non-stick skillet, and I'm gonna add 1/2 cup of plain white sugar. This 1/2 cup of sugar is gonna make something that's sweet, but not cloyingly, so it's not gonna be like a candy or a dessert kind of thing, which is good because I wanna use this for a savory application. Now, in regards to the heat level for this, I would say cook this as hot as you dare to. It really doesn't matter the precise level that you cook this at, because at least for the first while, there's a lot of water in this, and all you're really doing is boiling off all the water. But the hotter you go with this, the more it's gonna hiss and splatter, and the higher likelihood there is that you're gonna burn yourself. So I would say if you don't wanna risk it, you can go nice and low and slow, and then just stir it frequently so that you can release all of that steam and water vapor. But if you wanna go faster and you're willing to risk it, especially if you have one of these splatter guards here, it really comes in handy for this. You can go at probably medium-high, that's what I'm on right now, and it comes out just the same. In fact, the conventional wisdom around jams or preserves is the shorter amount of time that you can cook it, the better, because you're gonna drive off fewer of those aromatic volatile compounds that are in the fruits. And this applies for any fruit, which means the more flavorful and fresh tasting your jam or preserves or whatever you're making is gonna be. But regardless of what heat you're on, you do want to stir it relatively frequently to, one, make sure that nothing is sticking to the pan and potentially burning, but also because you want to cook this as evenly as possible. Every stovetop has hot spots and cold spots on it. It's just inevitable that it's going to happen. So stirring frequently can kind of even out the temperature inside the pan. So I'm just going to keep going with this, and what I'm looking for is for the color to darken slightly, and for when I drag a spatula through it, it leaves a trail behind it. I don't want this to be runny, so once I see that trail kind of being left behind the spatula, kind of like that there, I know I've boiled off enough water and the pectin has thickened it up enough to where when this cools down, it's gonna set up into something that's more spreadable than runny. So this is looking done there, and that's it for the jam. In terms of timing, it's hard to say exactly how long it should take you, because like I said before, it really depends on how hot you're cooking it. But for reference, I cooked this on about medium-high, and it took me around 10 minutes. So for the sandwich, you're gonna wanna cook this pretty far in advance because it's gonna need at least a couple hours to cool down in the fridge. But once it does, it's sandwich time. So let's get into that part now. I'm gonna start by throwing a tablespoon of butter into my cast iron pan because I'm gonna toast my bread in that. Speaking of which, I'm gonna hack off a couple slices from this crusty kind of country loaf that I made the other day. You obviously don't have to make your own bread for this, but if you've never done it, I would say baking a nice loaf of bread is kind of one of the most satisfying things you could ever do in a kitchen, so I would highly recommend trying it if you've never tried. And if you want to know how to do that, I made a short about that you can find that shows you how I made that. So once the butter's melted, I'm gonna get that toasting. I'm not gonna try to get a super dark toast on this. Basically what I'm trying to do is enrich the bread with a little bit of that butter and maybe get a tiny bit of crust on it. This kind of rustic country loaf is delicious, but in the context of a sandwich, it can be a little too chewy sometimes, and it can have maybe a little too much integrity and can be pretty unforgiving to the rest of the ingredients inside the sandwich. So I think this step of toasting it in some butter, getting that fat inside the bread, actually kind of softens it up a bit. It makes it play a little bit nicer with everything else in the sandwich. But there is a kind of balance there that I'm trying to achieve, and I think getting too dark of a crust on this would add too much rigidity back to the bread and kind of counteract what I'm trying to do. So just a light toast is all I want. Like right there, that looks good. So I'm gonna pull that and let that rest on the board for a minute. And I want that to cool down just a little bit. So in the meanwhile, I'm gonna dress some salad greens for the sandwich. And today I'm gonna do some arugula, and I'm just gonna really simply dress it with olive oil and some sherry vinegar. If you wanted to for this, you could go through the whole process of making an emulsified salad dressing by whisking these together, maybe with some Dijon mustard or something like that, and actually get something emulsified that's gonna stick to the leaves better. But in this context, I just don't care enough. I'm basically just trying to season the arugula a little bit with some vinegar and some oil, so this is gonna be just fine. Okay, now time for sandwich assembly. I'm gonna start with a smear of my peach preserves. I wouldn't add too much more than what I'm doing here, because while I didn't add a ton of sugar to this, it is still pretty sweet, and you don't want the sweetness to kind of take over the whole thing. After that comes some premium ingredients. Here I've got some fresh mozzarella. that was made at my local grocery store. The freshest, milkiest, tangiest mozzarella is what I'm after here. After that, I'm gonna do some mortadella. Mortadella is an emulsified Italian sausage that's cut really thin, and I'm using it here today because it has a much more kind of delicate flavor than a lot of other types of charcuterie. I think if I put something like salami on this, it would just take over everything and make no sense. So I think for this little fancy boy sandwich I'm making here, mortadella is the way to go. Or you could just use bologna. And then lastly, I'm gonna pile on as much of that arugula as I can get on there. Arugula is kind of peppery and hot and almost has like kind of a funky thing. I don't know. It's hard to describe, but I think it plays really well with this sandwich. And if you want to make this a more complete dinner type of meal, you can serve it with a soup. I've got some gazpacho today that I'm going to serve it with. I have a short on that as well if you want to see how I made that. I'm going to go ahead and cut this sandwich in half. That's a great looking cross section, I think. And that's it. That's a great little summertime meal. You know, peaches and tomatoes in the summer. What could be better? The combo of this sandwich with the gazpacho is really, really good. I think it goes together great. And it's such a nice, light, yet refined summertime meal. And you too could have it all and become your own little bistro boy and try this out sometime. If you do, let me know in the comments what you think. Thanks.